The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the open highway that stretched endlessly ahead. The Johnson family's SUV glided smoothly along the winding road, its tires humming a gentle rhythm against the asphalt. Inside, the air buzzed with excitement and the kind of joyous chaos that only a family road trip could bring. Jason Johnson, a man of steady nerves and an ever-calm demeanor, gripped the steering wheel with a relaxed confidence. His eyes occasionally flicked to the rearview mirror, where his teenage children, Brianna and Alex, were playfully bickering over the playlist Natalie, his wife, had carefully curated on her phone. This was no ordinary trip. It was a celebration. Brianna, at just 17, had achieved what many could only dream of, an acceptance letter from Stanford University. Jason and Natalie had decided to mark the occasion with a scenic drive from Austin, Texas, to Santa Fe, New Mexico. It was the kind of memory they hoped their children would cherish forever, a moment of family unity, laughter, and pride. The desert landscape unfolded around them, an endless expanse of golden sand and red rock formations that looked like nature's monuments. Jason had deliberately chosen a route through the back roads, wanting to give his family a taste of the serene beauty far removed from the chaos of city life. The air inside the SUV was light-hearted, filled with Alex's goofy jokes and Brianna's teasing retorts. Natalie glanced at Jason, her face softening into a smile. He had always been the rock of their family, a man who found joy in the small moments, even as his mysterious government job often kept him away. For years, the details of Jason's work had been a vague topic in their household. All they knew was that he worked for the government, a phrase he used to politely dodge further questions. But to Natalie and the kids, it didn't matter. He was their Jason, their dad, the one who made pancakes on Saturdays and sat through Alex's endless explanations of his favorite video games. The quiet joy of the trip was interrupted when Jason noticed something in the rearview mirror. A patrol car creeping up behind them, its red and blue lights flashing insistently. Its easy smile faded, replaced by a calm seriousness. He tapped the brakes and guided the SUV to the gravel shoulder of the narrow road. Natalie, sensing the shift in his demeanor, turned toward him. "Why are they stopping us?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. Jason kept his gaze fixed on the mirror, his voice measured and calm. "I don't know. Let's just stay calm." In the back seat, Brianna and Alex fell silent, their earlier chatter replaced by uneasy glances at each other. The SUV rocked slightly as Jason shifted into park. The flashing lights behind them painted the desert in jolts of red and blue, a stark contrast to the peaceful hues of the setting sun. Two officers stepped out of the patrol car. Jason's eyes tracked their movements in the mirror. Both men carried an air of authority that seemed less about the badge and more about the weight of their stares. One was older, stocky, with a furrowed brow and mirrored sunglasses that reflected the dying sunlight. The other was younger, taller, with a sharpness in his eyes that made the hairs on the back of Jason's neck rise. Jason rolled down his window as the older officer approached on his side. "License and registration," the man said curtly, his tone clipped and devoid of warmth. Jason moved slowly, deliberately, as he reached for his wallet. "Sure, officer," he said, his voice calm and even. He handed over the documents, his eyes briefly meeting the officer's. The officer barely glanced at them before looking back at Jason. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his tone more of an interrogation than a casual question. Jason's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his composure. "We're on our way to Santa Fe, just a family trip." The younger officer circled the vehicle, peering into the windows. His gaze lingered on Brianna and Alex in the back seat, then shifted to the luggage piled neatly behind them. "What's in the car?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Just clothes, snacks, the usual road trip stuff," Jason replied, his voice still steady but with an edge of guardedness. The older officer's lip curled slightly, a gesture that didn't escape Jason's notice. "Mind if we take a look?" Jason hesitated, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Natalie's hand found its way to his arm, a silent plea for caution. Brianna and Alex exchanged anxious glances, their teenage confidence shaken by the sudden tension. Jason took a deep breath, his mind calculating his next move. "Officer," he said carefully, "is there a reason for this stop?" The older officer leaned in closer, his mirrored sunglasses obscuring his eyes but not the thinly veiled hostility in his tone. "Just routine," he said. "You seem out of place." The words hit like a slap, the unspoken meaning hanging heavy in the air. Jason's hand tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. He glanced at his family, Natalie's worried eyes, Brianna's tense posture, Alex's wide-eyed confusion. He could feel the weight of their trust in him, their belief that he would keep them safe. But safety was a fragile thing, easily shattered. As the younger officer stepped back, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon, Jason knew this encounter was about to take a dangerous turn. He remained calm on the surface, but his mind raced, assessing the situation, calculating the risks. What these officers didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Jason Johnson was far more than a husband and father. He was a highly trained CIA operative, a man who had faced dangers these officers couldn't imagine. And while he had spent years hiding that part of himself from his family, he knew that if this encounter escalated, he might have no choice but to reveal it. For now, though, he held his ground, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath. The older officer stepped back, motioning to his partner. "Pop the trunk," he said, his voice carrying an air of finality. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't move. Instead, he met the officer's gaze, his voice steady but firm. "Officer, I'd like to know the reason for this search." The tension crackled like static electricity, the air thick with unspoken threats. Natalie gripped Jason's arm tighter, her knuckles white. In the back seat, Brianna and Alex held their breath, their eyes darting between their father and the officers. As the officers exchanged a glance, Jason felt the weight of their scrutiny. He knew this wasn't about a broken taillight or a routine stop. This was about power, prejudice, and something far more insidious. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, Jason realized they were on the brink of something that could change everything. Jason's breath felt heavier now, though his face betrayed no sign of unease. Years of training had taught him to mask his emotions, to project calm when chaos threatened to take over. But this wasn't a covert mission overseas or a carefully orchestrated operation. This was his family, sitting vulnerable in an SUV on a desolate road, and that made everything infinitely more complicated. The older officer leaned closer, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting Jason's calm but resolute expression. "You're refusing to comply?" he asked, his tone just shy of a threat. Jason glanced briefly at Natalie, her hand still gripping his arm. He could see the worry etched into her face, but beneath it was something else: trust. She trusted him to handle this, to protect their family. It was a weight he carried willingly but heavily. "I'm not refusing anything," Jason said steadily. "I'm asking for clarity. Are we being detained? Have we done something wrong?" The officer's lip curled slightly, the faintest smirk of someone who believed they held all the power. He tapped his belt, his fingers brushing the edge of his holstered gun, a gesture Jason didn't miss. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Mr. Johnson," the officer said, emphasizing his name as if it held some hidden meaning. Jason didn't flinch. "The easy way would be you telling me why we were pulled over in the first place." The younger officer, standing near the trunk now, took a step forward. His hand rested on the edge of the SUV, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Jason. "You people always have questions, don't you?" he said, his tone low but sharp. Jason felt a spark of anger rise in his chest, but he forced it down. Losing his temper wouldn't help. He knew what the officer meant, even if he didn't say it outright. He heard it before, seen it before, subtle, dismissive, designed to provoke. But Jason wasn't going to take the bait. Not yet. Natalie's voice broke the tense silence, soft but resolute. "Officer, we're just a family on a road trip. We haven't done anything wrong. Can't we all just calm down?" Her words were gentle, meant to diffuse the situation, but the older officer's expression hardened. "Ma'am, step out of the car," he said, ignoring Jason completely now. Jason's heart sank. He knew this was escalating faster than he'd hoped. Natalie hesitated, her hand still on Jason's arm. She looked at him, searching his face for guidance. Jason shook his head slightly, a silent message. "Don't move." "Ma'am, I said step out of the car," the officer repeated, his voice louder this time. Jason turned back to the officer, his tone firm but calm. "She's not stepping out of the car. None of us are until you explain why we're being stopped." The officer's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses, and for a moment, everything was still. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, as if sensing the tension teetering on the edge of something irreversible. Brianna, sitting in the back seat, whispered under her breath, her voice trembling. "Dad, what's going on?" Jason didn't answer, his focus locked on the officers, but his silence spoke volumes to his children. It was the calm before a storm. The older officer sighed heavily, shaking his head as if Jason had forced his hand. "All right," he said, stepping back and gesturing to his partner. "We'll do this the hard way." The younger officer reached for the car door handle, but before he could open it, Jason spoke, his voice sharp and commanding in a way that froze everyone in place. "Stop." The word hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The younger officer hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. The older officer frowned, taking a step closer again. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mr. Johnson," the older officer said, his tone dripping with condescension. "If you've got nothing to hide, then cooperate." Jason's jaw tightened. He knew this game. He'd seen it play out in countless scenarios, though usually not with himself on this side of the line. He didn't want to escalate things further, but he also wasn't going to let these men bully his family. "I've told you everything you need to know," Jason said evenly. "We're a family on a road trip. We've done nothing wrong. If you have a warrant or a legitimate reason to search my car, then by all means, show it to me. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you let us continue on our way." The older officer's expression darkened. He stepped even closer, leaning down so that his face was level with Jason's. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said quietly, his voice low and menacing. Jason met his gaze without flinching. "I think I know my rights." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. In the back seat, Alex shifted nervously, his eyes darting between his father and the officers. Brianna sat frozen, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Finally, the older officer straightened up, his mouth a thin line. He turned to his partner and jerked his head toward the patrol car. "Run his plates," he said curtly. The younger officer hesitated, glancing back at Jason. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but then he nodded and walked back to the patrol car. Jason watched him go, his mind racing. He knew what they'd find. His cover was solid, meticulously maintained by the agency. On paper, he was just another government employee, a civil servant with a clean record and no reason to raise suspicion. But there was always a chance, however slim, that something could go wrong. A flag in the system, a piece of information that didn't quite add up, and if that happened, Jason pushed the thought aside. He couldn't afford to dwell on it now. Instead, he focused on the older officer, who was still standing by the driver's side door, his eyes fixed on Jason with a mix of suspicion and disdain. "Sir," Jason said, his voice calm but firm, "I'd like to know what you're looking for. We're not criminals. We're not hiding anything. We're just trying to get to Santa Fe." The officer didn't respond right away. He seemed to be weighing his options, deciding how far he could push. Finally, he shrugged, a lazy gesture that somehow felt like a threat. "Just doing my job," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Jason didn't reply. He simply watched as the officer stepped back, his posture still tense. In the back seat, Natalie reached for Jason's hand, squeezing it gently. He glanced at her, his expression softening for just a moment. "It's going to be okay," he said quietly, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The younger officer was still in the patrol car, presumably running Jason's plates. The older officer stood a few feet away, his hand resting casually on his belt, though Jason knew it was anything but casual. Finally, the younger officer returned, his face unreadable. He whispered something to the older officer, who frowned deeply. Jason watched them closely, trying to gauge their reaction. Whatever they'd found or hadn't found, it wasn't what they'd been expecting. The older officer turned back to Jason, his expression hard to read. For the first time since the stop began, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But before he could speak, the radio on his shoulder crackled to life, its sharp, tinny voice breaking the tense silence. Both officers stiffened, their attention momentarily diverted. Jason's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over yet. The radio's crackle filled the charged silence in the air, its sharp sound pulling everyone's attention momentarily. The older officer stepped away from the SUV to answer the call, his hand hovering near his radio as if bracing for something significant. Jason's eyes followed him, every fiber of his being on high alert. The tension in the car was palpable, a quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface. "Dad," Alex whispered from the back seat, his voice breaking slightly. "What's going on? Why are they acting like this?" Jason turned his head just enough to meet his son's worried gaze in the rearview mirror. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. "Just stay calm and do exactly what I tell you." Brianna sat stiffly next to Alex, her hands clenched together tightly. She looked out the window at the officers, her mind racing with questions. She had always seen her father as unshakable, a rock of stability in their lives. But now, seeing the subtle tension in his jaw, and the way his fingers gripped the steering wheel, she realized he was navigating something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The younger officer lingered by the car, his eyes darting between Jason and the rest of the family. His earlier bravado seemed to have faded slightly, replaced by something more guarded. Jason noticed it too. The small shift in posture, the hesitation in his movements. He was clearly processing whatever had come through on that radio. Natalie leaned closer to Jason, her voice barely audible. "What are they doing? Why haven't they let us go yet?" Jason didn't answer right away. He was watching the older officer, who had moved a few paces away, speaking quietly into his radio. His back was turned, but Jason could see the tension in his stance. Something was happening, something they weren't sharing yet. Jason turned his attention back to the younger officer, deciding to test the waters. "Officer," he said evenly, keeping his tone calm but firm, "we've been more than cooperative. If there's an issue, I'd like to know what it is." The younger officer glanced at Jason, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he might respond, but then he looked away, his hand brushing against the edge of his holstered weapon. The subtle movement wasn't lost on Jason. "Stay in the vehicle," the younger officer said, his voice clipped, as he stepped back toward the patrol car. Jason exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His mind raced with possibilities, trying to piece together the puzzle. They hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't given these officers any reason to escalate things this far. But he also knew that reason didn't always factor into situations like this. The older officer returned moments later, his expression harder than before. He motioned for his partner to join him, and the two of them stood a few feet away from the SUV, speaking in hushed tones. Jason strained to catch fragments of their conversation, but couldn't make out much. Still, their body language told him enough. They were deliberating, weighing their next move. Natalie's hand found his again, her grip firm. "Jason," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you think they know about your job?" Jason shook his head slightly. "No, they wouldn't. My cover is clean." "But what if it's not?" She pressed, her eyes searching his. "What if they're stalling because—" "Don't," Jason interrupted gently but firmly. "Don't jump to conclusions. We stick to the facts." But even as he said it, Jason couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt creeping into his mind. What if something had gone wrong with his cover? What if these officers had flagged him for something unrelated to the stop, something buried deep within classified records? The thought sent a chill down his spine. Outside, the officers seemed to reach a decision. The older one stepped forward, signaling for Jason to roll down his window again. Jason complied, his calm mask firmly in place. "We're going to need you to step out of the vehicle," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Jason's heart sank, but he didn't let it show. "Why?" he asked, his voice steady. "What's the reason?" "Sir, we're not going to ask again," the officer replied, his hand resting on his belt. "Step out of the vehicle." Natalie's grip on his arm tightened, and Jason felt the unspoken fear radiating from her. He turned to her briefly, his expression softening for just a moment. Then he looked back at the officer and nodded. "All right," he said, "I'll step out." He moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible at all times. The officers watched him closely, their postures tense. Jason opened the door and stepped onto the gravel shoulder, the warm desert air hitting him like a wall. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," the older officer instructed. Jason hesitated, his mind racing. Complying meant giving up control of the situation, leaving himself vulnerable. But refusing could escalate things further, putting his family in even greater danger. He decided to comply for now. As he moved to place his hands on the hood, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the SUV's window. For a brief moment he saw not just himself, but the weight of the moment, the stakes, the danger, the responsibility of protecting his family. It was a fleeting image, but it anchored him. The younger officer moved in to pat him down, his movements brisk and mechanical. Jason stayed still, his mind working through scenarios, calculating his next move. He could feel Natalie's eyes on him from inside the car, her silent plea for him to stay safe. "Here," the younger officer said finally, stepping back. The older officer nodded, his expression unreadable. "What's in the trunk?" he asked. "Luggage," Jason replied evenly. "Snacks, road trip essentials." "Open it," the officer ordered. Jason's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He reached into his pocket for the keys, moving slowly to avoid any misinterpretation. He handed them to the younger officer, who moved to the back of the vehicle. As the trunk opened, Jason could hear Brianna and Alex whispering in the back seat, their voices filled with worry. Natalie's gaze never left him, her fear palpable. The younger officer rifled through the contents of the trunk, his movements methodical. Jason watched him closely, noting every detail. He knew there was nothing incriminating in there, but he also knew that these officers weren't looking for something specific. They were looking for an excuse. After a few tense moments, the younger officer closed the trunk and walked back to the older one. He shook his head slightly, and Jason felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. The older officer turned back to him, his expression hard. "You're free to go," he said curtly. Jason's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't argue. He nodded, stepping back toward the driver's seat. As he got in, Natalie reached for his hand again, her relief evident. But as Jason started the engine and pulled back onto the road, his mind was already racing ahead. The officers had let them go, but something about the encounter didn't sit right. There was more to this than what had just unfolded, and Jason knew he couldn't ignore it. The road ahead stretched out before them, winding through the desert like a question waiting to be answered. The SUV moved through the desert roads, its tires crunching against gravel as the family sat in tense silence. Jason's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror out of instinct. The patrol car was no longer visible, but its presence lingered in everyone's minds. Jason could feel Natalie's gaze on him, her unease silently demanding answers he wasn't ready to give. "Dad," Brianna finally broke the silence, her voice soft but edged with worry. "What was that all about? Why did they act like we'd done something wrong?" Jason glanced at her in the mirror, his expression calm but unreadable. "Sometimes people jump to conclusions without reason," he said. "What matters is that we're okay now." Brianna didn't look convinced, and Alex leaned forward from the back seat. "But they didn't even apologize," he muttered. "It's like they wanted to find something on us." Natalie placed a hand on Alex's knee, a quiet gesture to settle him. "Let's just focus on getting to Santa Fe," she said, her voice steady despite the undercurrent of tension. But even as she spoke, Jason could see her glancing at him, her eyes asking the questions she wouldn't say aloud. Jason's mind was working overtime, replaying the encounter with the officers. Something about it didn't add up. Their questions, that hesitation. It wasn't just routine. He knew how to spot when someone was fishing for information, and those officers had been fishing. For what he couldn't be sure, but the encounter left a bad taste in his mouth. As the SUV continued down the road, Jason's phone buzzed in the console. He hesitated before picking it up, glancing at Natalie, who gave him a knowing look. "Don't let the kids see," she murmured under her breath. Jason angled the phone slightly, shielding the screen as he read the message. It was from a secure contact, one he hadn't heard from in months. The message was brief but clear. "Status compromised. Proceed with caution." His stomach tightened. The words confirmed what he had been dreading. Somehow, despite every precaution, his cover had been blown. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. The officers, they had been stalling, likely waiting for confirmation from someone higher up. But why had they let him go? Was it a mistake or part of a larger trap? "Everything okay?" Natalie asked quietly, her voice low enough that the kids wouldn't hear. Jason slipped the phone into his pocket and nodded, forcing a calm expression. "It's fine," he said, though they both knew it wasn't. The desert stretched out ahead of them, vast and empty, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He scanned the horizon, his trained eyes searching for anything out of place. A glint of light on a distant ridge caught his attention, but it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "Dad, are we stopping soon?" Alex asked, breaking Jason's concentration. "I'm starving." Jason glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was later than he realized, and they still had a few hours to go before reaching Santa Fe. "We'll find a place soon," he said. "Just hang tight." A small diner appeared on the horizon, its neon sign flickering against the fading light. Jason slowed the SUV and turned into the gravel parking lot, the crunch of the tires loud in the still evening air. The family filed out of the car, stretching after the long drive, but Jason stayed alert, his eyes sweeping the area. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, save for an older couple in the corner and a waitress behind the counter. Jason chose a booth near the window, where he could keep an eye on the SUV and the road. Natalie noticed his careful positioning but didn't comment, a focus on keeping the kids calm and distracted. The waitress approached with a tired smile, taking their orders quickly before disappearing into the kitchen. Brianna and Alex bickered over the menu, their voices lightening the mood slightly, but Jason's attention was elsewhere. He spotted a man in a dark jacket sitting alone at the counter, his posture too casual to be natural. The man glanced at Jason, their eyes meeting for a brief moment before he looked away. Jason leaned closer to Natalie, his voice low. We might need to leave sooner than planned. She frowned but didn't argue. Do you think? I don't know yet, he cut her off gently. But stay ready. The food arrived, and the family ate quickly, the tension still palpable. Jason kept his movements casual, but his mind was racing. He noticed the man at the counter pull out a phone, typing something quickly before slipping it back into his pocket. It was a small detail, but it set off alarms in Jason's head. As they left the diner, Jason's instincts screamed at him to move fast. He ushered the family into the SUV, his tone firm but calm. "Buckle up," he said. "We're not stopping again until we get there." Natalie looked at him, her concern deepening. "Jason, what's going on?" "I'll explain later," he promised, starting the engine. "Right now, we just need to keep moving." The SUV pulled back onto the road, the diner fading into the distance. Jason kept a close eye on the rearview mirror, his heart pounding as he spotted headlights in the distance. They weren't close enough to be immediate danger, but they stayed in his line of sight, a constant reminder that someone might be following them. The landscape around them darkened as the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert taking on an eerie stillness. The kids had grown quiet in the back seat, sensing the shift in their parents' energy. Natalie sat rigidly in her seat, her hand resting on the armrest, as if bracing for whatever was to come. Jason's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at it briefly. Another message from the same contact: "Do not stop. They're tracking you." The words sent a chill through him, but he couldn't let it show. "Everyone okay back there?" he asked, his tone light. "Yeah," Brianna said, though her voice was subdued. "Are we close to Santa Fe?" "Getting there," Jason replied, his grip on the wheel tightening. The headlights in the distance grew closer, and Jason's pulse quickened. He pressed the gas pedal slightly, the SUV picking up speed. The family didn't question it, the unspoken tension filling the car like a heavy cloud. Jason's mind raced, calculating his options. The road ahead was long and desolate, with no immediate exits or places to hide. Whoever was following them wasn't in a hurry to close the distance, but Jason knew it was only a matter of time. The SUV sped through the darkness, the desert around them vast and empty, yet filled with unseen threats. Jason kept his eyes on the road, his focus razor sharp. Whatever was coming, he knew one thing for certain: he had to protect his family at all costs.